Welcome, everyone. I will say good morning to those on a different time zone. Good afternoon to all of you here on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Laura Chase, President and CEO of ITS America. So the topic for today's webinar couldn't be more timely. And it's so important to all of us here at ITS America, but also to everyone who's joining us on this panel and all of you tuning in. And quite frankly, it should be of concern to everybody across the country, no matter where you live. I wrote a blog post some of you may have seen last week in advance of Thanksgiving about the tragic increase in roadway fatalities that we've seen in the first 6 months of this year, coming on the heels of another increase in 2020 when we drove fewer miles during the pandemic. But the reality is that whether you live in a rural community, suburban community, or urban community, this affects all of us. You may drive a car, ride a bus, take transit, but we are all pedestrians some of the time. And we all know that walking and biking have significantly increased over the course of the pandemic. So vulnerable road users are at much higher risk now than ever before. And we also know that some communities are being disproportionately affected. Pedestrian deaths are worse for people of color at a rate of 2 to 1 compared to white pedestrians, according to research released last year. On a personal note, this is actually something very personal to me. I have twin 15-year-old boys who every single day are vulnerable road users. They ride their bikes to school and cross a 6-lane road to get there and get home. And I worry about it every single day. I worry about their safety. So it will come as no surprise that I am a strong advocate for deploying technology to reverse this trend and protect vulnerable road users. It is simply the best tool that we have to reduce crashes and save lives. Now, I will say that we need all of your ideas and engagement to reverse these trends. So thank you again for your time today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing an excellent discussion. And I'm now very pleased to be able to turn things over to Kristen White, ITS America's new Chief Operating Officer, who will moderate today's conversation. So without further ado, Kristen, please join us.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks again to everyone for being here today. I am so excited for this discussion, everyone. Even though I'm only in my second month here at ITS America, this is something that's been relevant for all of us. And so today's goals of our discussion are to understand the perspectives of vulnerable road users and what we need to do to help keep them and our communities safe. The second goal is to showcase some of the really innovative technologies that are taking place from industry leaders here on the call. The third is to really understand some of the new technologies that they're deploying and how we can support them and pilot them in our own communities and really understand how we can collaborate moving forward, especially on the eve of a historic investment with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that will find opportunities to invest in some of the ideas you'll hear about today. So I'm going to welcome the panelists to join me now by joining me on camera. And we're first going to hear shortly from each of them on their own individual perspectives and then dive into a discussion. So first, we're going to hear from Christina Escorb, the Vice President of Government Affairs of Velodyne LiDAR. And after Christina, we're going to hear from Everett Lott, Acting Director of the District Department of Transportation here in Washington, D.C. Third, we're going to hear from Jane Terry, who is the Vice President of Government Affairs of the National Safety Council and a wonderful leader in this space. We'll then hear from George Villarreal from the Texas Department of Transportation, where he is the Deputy Director of their Traffic Safety Operations and has some innovative ideas to share. And last but certainly not least, we will hear from Spoke Safety with David Bartlett, their Chief Technology Officer. So everyone, we really have brought top thought leadership here today. And so we're going to invite Christina to share her thoughts first as we hear about Velodyne LiDAR's innovations.
Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate the invitation to join today. As you mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for Velodyne LiDAR. I'll top your 2 months. I've been here 4 months, but most recently coming from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And focused on managing our public policy and educating the public sector about our technology, which is the use of eye-safe lasers to map in 3D real-time environments where these sensors are placed. And it has a lot of different applications relevant to vulnerable road user safety. We're looking primarily in automotive and infrastructure applications. I'm really excited today in particular to hear about how states and our communities are looking at technology and really how we can engage more successfully and productively over the coming implementation of the infrastructure bill. I think it's going to be really important given all the emphasis that the bill had on the incorporation of technology to address vulnerable road user safety. So again, glad to be here.
Thank you, Christina. Everett, from a district and a local perspective, please share us some of your early ideas in this discussion.
Well, Kristen, again, thank you very much for having me and being a part of this panel today. Again, my name is Everett Lott. I am the acting director for the District Department of Transportation. And similar to what Laura had mentioned a little bit earlier, I also have a 14-year-old son who uses, various modes of transportation to get to and from school every day. And so, as the director of the District Department of Transportation, as a user, as a customer, as a resident, I am equally as concerned about, what is happening in our roadways. And so we're doing everything that we can here in Washington, D.C. to make our roadways for all users safer. Whether you're scooting, whether you're driving, whether you're on a bicycle, we want to make sure that it's a safe access for everyone across all different modes of transportation. So we're employing different strategies here in Washington, D.C. to make sure that we're doing that. And the mayor has made serious investments to make sure we're able to do that and have the resources. So I'm excited to be here, a part of the panel, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Everett. Let's go over to Jane. Jane, the National Safety Council has been very vocal in this. What is your perspective on technology's impact for vulnerable road users?
Kristen, thank you for inviting me to be here today. We're happy always to talk about safety. Of course, we're working to improve safety, we say from the workplace to any place, working in 3 areas with workplace safety, roadway safety, and also on the opioid overdose epidemic. And really all that comes together on the roads because so many people are mobile on and around the roadways for work. And then of course, we know we've got a problem with impaired driving on our roadways. So we're working always to keep people safe. We're also honored to lead the Road to Zero Coalition. It's over 1,700 organizations and individuals that have come together to say that we can reach zero fatalities on our roadways. And we've laid out a plan to get there. It's double down on what works. Advanced technology, which is so relevant to our conversation today to decrease those fatalities, and then also prioritize safety and use that safe systems approach. We've also called on the US DOT and the president to set a national goal of zero fatalities. And we look forward to talking about all this and more today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And we love that 2050 vision, which I know George is starting to implement down in Texas. George, what is your work going on in Texas and how are you approaching this topic?
That was a perfect segue, Kristen, and thank you for having me here. And thank you to ITSA and Velodyne for putting this getting us all together, because I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody else is working on, not just as much as sharing what I'm doing. So I am the Deputy Director for the Traffic Safety Division in Texas Department of Transportation. And we have adopted a zero fatality goal by the year 2050. And not only have we just adopted it, we have a really strong commission, which is our governing body for our DOT and legislature, that's really helping us in achieving that. So, the commission adopted a minute order, directing us to do it and by any means possible. And I'm fortunate in the way that we're organizationally structured in our division to where I actually have traffic engineering, behavioral traffic safety, crash data analysis, and traffic engineering all within the same division. So even though they're working at it from different angles, we have a way to look at it holistically from one perspective on how we can get there and really key in and identify, what it is that we need to work on. And it really does show even the equity side of things on how that interplays with all those E's of education, engineering, and enforcement. So with that being said, I'm really looking forward to this and I thank y'all for it. And I'm excited to hear what everybody has to share.
Thank you, George. And from the public sector, lastly and foundationally to another private sector perspective is Spoke Safety. David, what is Spoke working on that could inform today's discussion?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm so excited about what Spoke is working on. Really, in a sentence, it's the first connected IoT ecosystem for vulnerable road users to really deliver that contextual awareness and insight for every moment that you're out there on the road, sharing the road on your journey. So this is an exciting time we live in. The advance of technologies, sensor technologies, IoT technologies, cloud and edge technologies, and V2X technologies that can be combined with advance in LTE 5G communication. So a lot of acronyms there, but what I'm trying to say is we're kind of at the perfect storm here of technology where we can really make a difference in the world and keeping people safer on the roads by leveraging this technology. So that's what we're doing at Spoke.
Thank you so much, David. And that perfectly transitions us into our discussion. So as David noted, we are really at what he calls the perfect storm at the right time, where we have technology, a commitment to invest, and great thought leaders like these folks in our panel today to discuss how we move these innovations forward. So our first question for each of the panelists, starting with David and going in reverse order, is reflecting on the eve of the new historic investment of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Over $500 billion is being pumped into our economy and the infrastructure to help fund safety programs and the technology that can do just what we're talking about today: keep vulnerable road users safe. So starting with David, what opportunities do you see out of this new Jobs Act to help protect vulnerable road users leveraging technology?
Well, the opportunity really is to invest in all the different parts of the ecosystem. I said in my first comment about our role is building an IoT ecosystem, or an orchestrator of an IoT ecosystem, to really pull off safety, safer roads. It's not going to be done by a single technology. It's going to be done by a community working together. Hence this panel. Everybody on this panel is going to play an important role, as well as many other technology providers, app providers, map makers, each municipality. So what this act is going to do is help to provide the funding to help the larger ecosystem participate. I kind of think of it as like climate change isn't going to be solved by a single technology. It's the world working together. Safety is the same thing. So hopefully this will help us really bring in that ecosystem for everyone to contribute towards this goal.
Thank you, David. And George, we'll go to you next. State DOTs have to put these ecosystems together. George, how are you viewing the implementation of the Jobs Act in this space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the way we're looking at it is we have some strategic gap plans that we have established. And now with the influx of this additional funding, we are going to be able to address these gaps that we have in our TMS, our traffic management systems. So that's going to help us. The other thing with this bill too that we're finding beneficial is the fact that we can apply it towards cybersecurity as well. That's going to be very big as we continue to expand our traffic network and our technology abilities. So we're looking forward to that. And not only that, even in regards specifically to the vulnerable road users, I think this is even directing to use about 15% of your HSIP allocation to vulnerable road users as well. So that's just another step in directly being able to address that. And then the technology side of stuff, we have a lot of data that we have at our availability, and being able to utilize that data and strategically start placing these funds or these projects with these additional funds, it's really enabling us to accelerate a lot of these initiatives that we had with this influx of funding. So we're really looking forward to it.
I love the idea of accelerating this work. And George mentioned the highway safety improvement programs that are relevant across the country. Let's go to Jane. Jane, how is the National Safety Council viewing this bill and these priorities?
We were very excited to see the infrastructure bill get signed into law. And one of the provisions in there that we worked on is this vulnerable road user safety assessment. And so it will require states to look at their data. And George, glad to hear you talk about how much data you do have out there, but really look at that data, see where those fatalities are happening for vulnerable road users. And then what can you do to improve it? And then it also makes sure that you can use those funds, those HSIP funds, for things like leading pedestrian intervals, which is just a fancy way to say, let's let the pedestrians get in the road first before the cars go. So hopefully those drivers will be paying more attention. And really, I think this bill does a great job too of putting the focus on all roadway users, where before maybe we were a little bit more focused on what was happening on that blacktop only.
I love that perspective, Jane. Thank you. And that actually transitions us into Everett's understanding and reactions to the Jobs Act. Everett, Jane talked about prioritizing pedestrians and people who walk, bike, and roll. So how is DC and the district looking at the funding coming out of the new law?
Well, we're extremely excited about the funding. We have so many uses for it. In addition to our roads and our bridges, our aging infrastructure in that sense. We're also going to be using these monies to invest in our age traffic signal system. As we all know, the signalized intersections are one of the places where most incidents take place. And so as of today, we've had the several emerging applications that can help our vulnerable users, roadway users who are across the intersections. And so almost all these type of intersections and these type of applications, they need to work and work together and be consistent. So we're going to be employing a lot of our resources towards that. In addition, we also will extend the fiber network to some of our major arterial corridors and connect that to our traffic management system. And so this funding will provide us with an opportunity to, with this new infrastructure bill, to expedite that construction on new fiber communications throughout our network. So we're really excited about it. Can't wait to actually get the money in our hands.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Everett, for those great examples from signalized intersections and fiber. Let's finish our conversation on Jobs Act funding with Christina and Velodyne. What kinds of innovations are you thinking about coming out of this new law?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. I really appreciate what David said about the ecosystem, because I think that's really important, because the bill is huge. I've read most of it, at least one of the versions, but it is really staggering. It hits all different modes, all different ways of thinking about safety. And so, having been at the department and standing up new programs, I know the department is facing a huge amount of work when you're not looking at the existing streams of funding for surface transportation, but also these new grant programs. So like for LiDAR, which is a sensor-based intelligent transportation system enabling technology, we have new grant programs in the bill, or in the legislation that was passed in the SMART grant program that contemplates, intelligent sensor-based infrastructure, the Safe Streets and Roads for All that are talking about new transportation technologies and vehicle technologies. The bill also talks about crash avoidance and automatic emergency braking for vehicle safety that affect vulnerable road users, depending on how well that technology works. So it really is all encompassing, but really keeping sort of I don't want to say the pressure, but really the eye on these safety benefits that we will gain once the grant programs are stood up. The solicitations go out and the communities can really start testing the technology, piloting it, understanding what those benefits are and how they use the data analytics to improve safety. And that's something we're engaged in quite directly with the intelligent infrastructure side of things, and getting pilots stood up so that communities who maybe haven't thought about how to use technology in their infrastructure upgrades can really start to understand what those look like.
I love this conversation that's transitioning into actually getting these technologies into communities and allowing the communities to lead this. So I'd like to go now to kind of what Laura, our CEO, mentioned at the top about some of these alarming statistics that just seem to get more and more alarming. I mean, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, but really another pandemic with traffic fatalities. And so my question is for George, Everett, and Jane to start, with these numbers, which are not a surprise to us, even if they're sadly alarming. What strategies have you seen in communities that have really helped that you'd like our listeners to learn about? And maybe we'll start with George.
Yeah, it is very alarming, and we're even just tracking just locally here in Texas, the fatalities were trending towards almost over 4,000 just total fatalities in our roadways across the state this year, which is almost 10% of what the nation's has. And so, it is very alarming and very concerning for us. And specifically in working with the strategies in the communities, it's not equitable to assume that every person or every pedestrian or vulnerable road user can carry a connected device at all times. For the ones that are, we are currently going through some research projects to provide that, or to help with that connectivity to use it in order to prevent, to create notifications for the motorists, the pedestrians, and just using different technologies with these research projects and identifying how we can use that smart infrastructure for the communications. But even outside the communication side of things, and even outside of technology, we were actually able to utilize some previous Safe Routes to School funds to actually deploy over, I think to over 80% of our elementary and junior high schools across the state, bicycle information kits and education kits and blinking lights. And we know even in the past, when we look at how we were able to get the occupant restraint percentages up, we did that towards targeting the schools and having your kids tell their parents to do that. So, now we're targeting the schools on the bicycle and the pedestrian information and educating them as well. So, it really is twofold, looking at it through the technology side of things and how we can use our infrastructure and the data that's out there, to target it, but also even just the non-infrastructure and non-education side of things, or non-technology side of things, and using education components.
I love that. And we're starting to hear some of the E's of, right, the Vision Zero: enforcement, education, right, engineering. I love this. Everett, do you have any things that the district or your colleagues at the local level are doing to help address this?
Yeah, Kristen, again, this is a troubling statistic. DC it sounds like we're no different from any of the other states and other jurisdictions throughout the country. We've seen an increase in the number of fatalities, traffic fatalities in Washington, DC, and it is troubling. Our mission, our goal in DC is to equitably deliver a safe, reliable, sustainable, multimodal transportation network for all residents and all visitors who come here into Washington, DC. And so over the past years, we've taken a much more proactive approach toward our Vision Zero. We have become a Vision Zero city. And in doing that, we've really been aiming to improve pedestrian bicycle safety through our bicycle infrastructure, by showcasing the effective local actions that we can take, empowering our local leaders to take action, and also promoting partnerships in our communities throughout all 8 wards. This year, as part of our Vision Zero effort or our campaign, we've taken some of the proactive steps to shorten the time that it takes us to actually implement our safety improvements. We've accelerated our roadway and intersection improvements to ensure that our residents, our most vulnerable users, are able to have safe access. And so we've been installing throughout the district speed humps, stop sign installations, right turn hardening measures. We've been doing this throughout the district. These are the things that we've been hearing have been problems: speeding, reckless driving. So we've been doing things really to curb those type of behaviors. And as the acting director, my goal is to ensure that we take a closer look at making these changes. And so we've been really doing a lot more public engagement, and really engaging with the community to hear from them what's important to you, what is it that you feel is necessary, and recognizing that it's a joint partnership. So, we're going to do everything we can to engineer our roads differently to make them safer, but we also have to educate our folks to change the behaviors, because we have seen some extremely reckless behaviors out there. And most all of the unfortunate fatalities that we've experienced here in Washington, DC have been because of some reckless behavior, speeding, distracted driving, et cetera. So we're really doing a two-pronged approach of doing things that we can within our means, but also really educating the drivers and about their behaviors.
I love that community approach to really engaging the community, Everett, and making them the heart of the conversation. And that leads me to you, Jane. Jane, you and the National Safety Council have this national perspective. And so I would love to hear from you. What are some of the national strategies in different areas that we haven't heard from that we should be listening to and taking into our own home communities?
Well, a lot of it also just really breaks down to getting down to that community level. And one of the things that I've seen is looking at data from cities about where the crash is occurring. And in a lot of these places, it's in the same areas. You have high crash corridors, and you may have over half of your fatalities occurring on just 20% of your roadways. And I've seen that repeated over and over in communities. So I definitely encourage communities to look at their data and map it out to be able to get that granular information. I love engaging the community members, because sometimes you'll talk to them and you'll say, of course, that's a dangerous area. We all have seen crashes or near crashes in those spaces. And those people can be just wonderful resources for information. And then I think just another thing to consider too, when you're looking at these data, is we know there have been historical underinvestments in certain areas, certain communities in our country. And so we need to make up for that too, and figure out, well, of course, these areas may be less safe because they don't have the infrastructure, the sidewalks, the good striping of the lanes, things like that. I mean, just some basic needs that are out there for safe operations in and around our roadway system.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, Jane, the data being so important. And yes, we've got the data on fatalities, where crashes occur, but in this device that we've actually created a form factor from a 2.5-foot board that goes into an automobile to something that will go on a tube of a bike or in the backpack of a child or on a motorcycle very easily. We'll be collecting data also on where the near misses are, because we will provide the warning to prevent an accident. And so I think that's going to be a new wealth of data that we can add to the data you're talking about, because, you know, we know it's intersections, we know where, you know, where they occur, but where are the near misses? And it's not just on road, but off road as well. And you know, I think to George's and Everett's points on the great work they're doing in Texas and in DC, to add a technology to those efforts that also can complement LiDAR and radar and cameras with the CV2X 10 times a second pinging. Again, it's going to be that community effort that we're really going to hit the goal.
Well, I want to transition us a little bit and maybe take off our practitioner hats and put on the hats of just being a member of the public, right? We all have walked, biked, and been a member of these communities. And so we've probably all seen different ways in which we can interact with folks like us who are trying to innovate safety solutions. So I want to go to Jane first. Jane, what role can and should the public play to help us all reduce these numbers that we're talking about?
Well, I always like to tell folks we have thousands and thousands of new drivers each and every day, right? People turn 16, 17 years old to get their driver's license for the first time. So education is, of course, a very important player here in keeping people safe. And otherwise, I think just being involved in the community, get out there and advocate for the things that you need. And if you are a person who is a pedestrian or a cyclist, you know, how can you get involved with your community? Say, if they're going to repave a road, instead of adding vehicle lanes, could they potentially change the way that road is structured so that you add cyclist barriers and be able to separate those different modes of transportation from each other and factor in safety improvements there? Really think infrastructure investment and a focus on that is going to be key here, as well as integrating technology and thinking about V2X technology and also other technology that can help improve intersections as well.
And Christina, from a private sector perspective, is there anything you're thinking about when this question pops up?
And what the public can do, I can say from a personal perspective, you know, I'm also a mother of two sons who cross the road in front of their elementary school every day. We recently had a pedestrian incident in front of one of the schools, and it's actually an intersection where the public, you know, the parents, the community have been trying to install, I think George mentioned flashing lights, some sort of mitigation control measure, but it's taken years, and they're just now getting to the point where within the county and state and you know, all of the government bureaucracy, they've it's not that it's not an important issue, but it's a resourcing issue. And so I think as the states and the counties and the local governments are seeing more funding and more support to address these safety issues, from a private sector standpoint, my biggest concern is making sure that we are educating those public sector stakeholders about what technologies they might consider, what mitigations they might consider. And I love the idea of the public informing the government practitioners and stakeholders about those safety matters. I mean, so often it's a oh, everybody knows it's an issue. But I've seen it at a local level that so much of it is really local advocacy and making sure that something's done about it. And so I'm hopeful that over the next 5 to 10 years with this extra support that, you know, we'll see more acceleration in addressing the issues.
Thank you so much. And let's then transition to what some of these technologies can do. We have the benefit here of ITS America of convening all of you wonderful sectors. And so we have Christina and David here to talk about what Velodyne and Spoke are working on. Christina, can you give just a little bit more of a deep dive into what Velodyne is doing?
Yeah, for sure. Like I mentioned, I think For this discussion, the top priorities for Velodyne are how LiDAR technology is enhancing safety through automotive systems. So ADAS is traditionally what people refer to as the advanced driving assistance systems, like automatic emergency braking in front of a pedestrian. You know, the things that a vehicle can do to really enhance safety by preventing a collision. I will note, though, the Governor's Highway Safety Association has compiled a number of statistics demonstrating that most pedestrian fatalities, and I'm using pedestrian, but also other vulnerable road users as well, you know, using the term interchangeably, it happen at night. They happen when there's no light, low light, and the reality is right now that regulators aren't testing for no light conditions when they're looking at ADAS systems, these features. And so when NHTSA is reporting that the increase in pedestrian fatalities are largely, if not solely, attributable to risky driving behavior, you know, technology is great because for the most part, it's not influenced by fatigue or distraction or any of these other factors that may cause these pedestrian incidents. And so, you know, I'm very much looking forward to getting to the place where, you know, we can influence testing regimes that really prove out the technology in the scenarios where most of the safety issues arise, which is at night for pedestrians. LiDAR sees at night. It doesn't require its own light source. And so that's when it comes to vehicular safety, it is about reducing the single point of failure. I think, David, you mentioned, you know, multiple technologies. It's not just about LiDAR. In the infrastructure context, you know, placing one sensor at an intersection that can immediately map the environment and do things like what we were talking about, identifying the near misses. Why do so many pedestrian incidents happen at this intersection or along this roadway? Are we having more crossings along this roadway that we didn't contemplate people crossing? It enables either active signage so that if somebody is in the roadway, an obstruction, and LiDAR is particularly suited for this with humans because it sees soft objects and slow moving objects. You know, and to inform city planners and transportation officials about, you know, what they might consider to address those safety concerns. So I think, you know, both of those are really big priorities for Velodyne, especially given the nighttime abilities of LiDAR.
Incredible innovations, Christina. As someone who clearly needs some analog approaches to seeing better, it's just fascinating to see some of this. So David, would you mind talking about Spoke's innovative approach?
Yeah, you know, and let me just say, Christina, that I'm a big fan of LiDAR. I've worked on Li-Fi projects, including ones on intersections with Boston University. There's just so much potential. But as you said, you know, it's collective intelligence is going to get us over the goal line. So how can I complement LiDAR with Spoke? That's one of the questions. And so we decided what really needed in this space is a technology that can see through walls, see around corners, see what, you know, through obstructions that LiDAR can't see. And also I've looked at some of the AI interpretive errors and how we can help the correction of that so that AI does a better job of identifying what's in front of you. So the Spoke technology is able to add that element. So if this Spoke technology is saying there's a bicycle that's going to dart out between these two cars or come out from an intersection behind a building before LiDAR captures it, and then it adds that intelligence to LiDAR, you can make a more intelligent decision. So that's what I'm trying to do with Spoke. And I've built a big cloud foundation for this, a data lake to do continual machine learning, because I think it's also going to be how can we affect warnings and interpretations, as I said, with AI that get better and better, that can be delivered to whether you're on a bicycle or a motorcycle or in a car in a way that is going to do the job. You know, at the end of the day, people just don't want to be hit, and people don't want to hit people. So if we can do a better job interpreting the situation, predicting what's going to happen, and preventing it in the first place, then we've achieved it. So for me, it's a very much a a hardware play in terms of how we use technologies like CV2X coupled with LiDAR and coupled with radar and cameras and the convoluted neural network imaging that we can do. But it's also the software side of it where we can continuously learn from every event and continually fine tune. And it's going to be different for DC versus Texas versus the highway versus, you know, out on a rural road. And I think a lot of the early AI interpretive errors have been because where the training took place. And then when it was applied, and a lot of the early AI training was done more rurally. And when it was put in a complex city situation, you know, it interpreted the side of a truck as a billboard. One of the studies, there's a number of studies here, but you know, so I think the software side of it and the advances in AI are going to greatly help us move forward the way we need to. And that's what I'm focused on and spoke.
Amazing. And everyone who's listening in, what was fun for us as we started talking about this panel and what we wanted to talk about is we realized it's not just this innovation that's happening in the private sector, but states like Texas are also innovating as well. So I'd love to turn it over to George because George shared some really exciting things they're working on. George, please.
Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, and it really does piggyback well on both what David was saying and Christina was saying. Are you able to see my screen, Kristen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so what we have done in Texas is because we have all of our crash records, our CR3s are submitted electronically by law enforcement. So that was a collaboration and collective effort in itself. And that's all compiled within one of the sections in my division. So we have this data and we have a dashboard specifically developed towards pedestrian and pedicyclists, so our vulnerable road users. So as we're looking at that, we have data from 2011 to 2021. So one of the things that Christina mentioned is the hour of the day. You can look at the hour of the day and this dashboard is updated live as law enforcement agents are inputting their electronic crash records into the system. It gets populated on here live. So we can look at hour of the day. We can look at light condition. We have our state divided up by districts. If we wanted to look, for example, San Antonio district, whenever we click on San Antonio district, everything updates accordingly towards that district for the live data. So we have that information so we can identify if we are having dark conditions, what technologies do we need to utilize? And that's where LiDAR would come in exceptional in that because it is not contingent upon the lighting condition. But one of the things that David mentioned that I really appreciated is, you know, if we can take this data and if we start utilizing this into or putting this into an AI, even if it's just in one location, potentially looking at, this is all reactive data that we're looking at now, but if an AI can start looking at these and identifying certain factors or looking at risks, that's going to start pushing us into a proactive measure side of things to where we can maybe start warning motorists or the vulnerable road users in advance of a higher risky area, a time, or, you know, however we want to break down the data.
It almost leaves us speechless, everyone, at the incredible amount of data aggregation, data analysis, and yet the data tells us a story. So our next question is one that's sobering. George, your literal image in front of us shows us that not every community is impacted the same. And Laura and Jane have talked about this already today. We look at the figures in front of us and we see that in Texas, at least, Hispanic communities are more impacted by what we're talking about today, among many, many others. So my question to each of you, and I'd offer anyone to chime in, is what can we do to address these inequities? They are alarming and we need to take action now.
I'm happy to go first. I have some thoughts. I really do. To some of the points made earlier, at least as far as what we're looking at with LiDAR, is the disproportionate fatalities at night, right? When we know most of these incidents happen, most fatalities and serious injuries happen. And the fact that I think Laura mentioned that 2 times the rate, you know, with people of color, and LiDAR doesn't see color. And because it can see at night, we do see a tremendous benefit with respect to the safety impact when we're looking at ADAS that is LiDAR equipped on a vehicle. The problem is most of the ADAS systems on the road today are only radar and camera equipped. And so radar really does have limitations with the resolution. And that LiDAR can fill. And again, it's filling a gap. It's reducing the single points of failure. So from an equity and safety perspective for those vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable at those times, we do see a huge benefit with LiDAR, but also the accessibility of these systems to the drivers as well. Because right now, with the technology being so new, it's not going to be available to everybody buying a new car until it's more adopted by the automakers and they're in more of the vehicles on the road. So we want the safety benefit to be accessible to all, not just the people who can afford it and not just the people that the technology can see.
Yeah, and if you extend that thought to AI, and there's been a lot of study on some of the bias in AI interpretive algorithms, particularly with cameras and profiling, and but the way we're using AI is really just detecting for any vulnerable road user without any profiling, of course, but just treating each class, whether it's cyclist, somebody on a scooter, somebody on a motorcycle, somebody in a car, and how we prevent collisions. But having been through some of the errors that have been made in AI training and some of the biases that can be introduced, I'm very aware of this and will ensure that our technology does not do that. And we're trying to get one of our guiding principles in Spoke is, it's connected and available for all. So that means the right price point, the right form factor, so that everybody can take advantage of it to help keep everybody safe.
Thank you, Christina and David. I see Everett has unmuted himself, and we'll go to Everett next. But I just want to remind everyone, if you have not opened the chat box, we've got a question there. And also Jane very graciously posted some of the crash analysis that the Safety Council has put together on her website, which we can send out as well. But Everett, this is a really important, thing that I know your community is thinking about. Well, how are you approaching this?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned earlier, as we have been engaging with the community and going through all 8 wards of the district, we've really taken that opportunity to really do some more safety education campaigns as well. So as we're out in the communities, we're actually educating the community. What we've learned and what I've learned is that, many of the interventions that we've used and deployed throughout the district, several groups, several communities didn't know what those interventions were for, and didn't know how they were used in such a way to deter our, bad or behavior or to slow traffic down. And so we've been really educating them about the various interventions that we're using, letting them know they're not just a bicycle lane, but it actually narrows the roadway. And in that, it slows traffic down. And so, so they'll see the other benefits, not recognizing that, yeah, it does serve a purpose of, allowing for people to travel via bike, but it also has other auxiliary benefits. And that's been a really major, I think, improvement for us in terms of the buy-in that we've been able to receive from residents in different wards of the district. And so we're continuing to educate. We have a lot of different safety campaigns that we've been employing on radio and TV ads, and again, just going out into the community. We have a vast group of community engagement specialists, and so they have been trained to go out into the neighborhoods, into the community, meet with the most grassroots elected position, and we call those advisory neighborhood commissioners, and also help to train them because they can actually go and do some of that workforce as well. So it's been a multi-pronged approach, but education has been what has served us well up to this point.
I love that term, Everett, community engagement specialist. Maybe one of our call to actions today is that each and every one of us can be one of those folks moving forward. So I think what we're going to do now, everyone, is transition into audience Q&A. So this is just a reminder to our participants today, there is the question and answer feature in Zoom, and we do have some nice and robust comments here, or questions here. And there is one comment that one of our thought leaders, Anand Prasad in Santa Clara County, wanted to remind us of some of the great innovations they're working on in Santa Clara County, including some pedestrian sensing intersections that actually extend the time for pedestrians to walk across intersections. So that's great. And he shared a YouTube link there. But our first question is for any one of our panelists that wants to respond. Are there efforts to gather any sort of redundant data to counter some of the sensor limitations we've talked about today? David, you talked about supplemented data, building off other technologies. Christina, you're building those innovations as we speak. Are there any of these pieces of data that can actually help in adverse weather environments?
Well, sure. I mean, it's all about interpreting what's going on and giving the right advisory or advice or prescriptive action that you need to take. And we are limited by sensor faults, where the sensors are placed. So any additional input we can provide, the clear picture that we're going to be able to give. And so that's what I call this collective intelligence effort that we've been working on, to collect everything that's being transmitted from sensors out there in intersections and roadside units, coming from social media, coming from LiDAR, radar, camera interpretation. So it's really, again, this perfect storm of technology where we have the ability to collect intelligence from many different nodes, bring them together in kind of a neural network, and really create a much sharper image of what's going on. That takes a lot of processing power. It takes a lot of speed in terms of gathering and getting it out there. And the good news is the technology is at a point where we can make this happen. So I'm committed to helping to do that, working with that, of course, ITS America and the municipalities.
Fantastic, David. Thank you. And we did note there was a specific question for Christina and Velodyne that she's answering in the chat box related to the LiDAR features. Christina, if there's anything you want to add, please feel free to.
Yeah, I was trying to address a couple of them. I guess this is my first time using that function. But yes, the LiDAR installations can be moved. They're portable if you load them back on a trailer and move them to a different intersection if you're not working at placing, or not yet at the point where you're placing multiple sensors at different locations along the roadway. I think there was another question about adverse weather and building in redundancy also, or making sure that that's addressed. That David, you were talking about this a little bit, but for the infrastructure solution that we're focused on, our sensors are very robust. They go through a lot of testing, whatever. We have actually a wonderful YouTube video on that, showing them getting blasted and frozen and all the things. But that is something that is also a benefit of LiDAR, because it does perform in some of those degraded visual conditions where you might run into problems with camera. There was a question about lighting as well, just knock a couple of these out, and whether the installation of more roadway lighting would help, and are we just trying to, I guess, resolve a problem with a more expensive or new solution? And the reality is that we're not always going to have lighting along a roadway. I mean, that's just the reality. I've seen statistics where we see growth in pedestrian fatalities in rural areas. Growing up in Iowa, as we've discussed, is you don't have any lighting on those county roads. And so, when we're talking about automotive systems, especially, it's particularly impactful and important to look at the fact that if you're testing these systems in a realistic environment.
Not just like to add, also thinking about the technology that's in the vehicle too is an important thing. So not just in the built environment, and looking at headlights and their ability to light what is ahead is key. And I know IIHS has done a lot of work on this. So having good headlights, of course, is important. And then also one of the things that we recommend at the Safety Council is for the NCAP, or New Car Assessment Program, to also do testing on what happens if a vehicle does strike a pedestrian or other vulnerable road user, and how can the potential injuries there be lessened when that happens. And so we would like to see some updates to the NCAP program to be able to improve the safety of vehicles as well.
Excellent. I really appreciate that, Jane, and Christina, for answering all those tailored questions to the technology we're all developing. I want to go into one of the additional questions, which speaks really to the heart of our conversation today, which is collaboration. So Ram Bayapati asked, what collaboration opportunities do each of you see between the infrastructure owner operators like George and Everett and cities and states across the nation, and all of you developing the technology and showcasing the technology at a national level? Is there something specific we can be doing? And he does actually give a specific question about maybe even enhancing some of the perception capabilities of automated driving systems. But I'd love to open this up to any of our panelists to see any ideas they have on what we should do to collaborate on this topic in the future.
Well, if I could answer from a technology perspective, keeping our platforms open, using open APIs to communicate information, sharing information. I think there's so many companies, and we have to be sensitive to privacy laws, confidentiality, but if we can anonymize the data and kind of resist what so many companies try to do in terms of protecting the data and monetizing the data, and just share it more so that we can collectively, for the good of people and safety and what we're trying to do in our cities. I mean, it's going to go a long way. And so technology, again, we can solve that by anonymizing the data, by keeping our platforms open, by providing open APIs, by having policies that allow us to share the right data together and build it together. I think that's our opportunity.
And Kristen, I would add, Washington, D.C. is sandwiched right in between Virginia and Maryland. And so, if there is an opportunity for us to partner and collaborate with our neighbors to the south and to the north of us, to make sure that we have the same type of platform so that it actually allows for us to be able to communicate a lot better, that would be a benefit and a win to the region, to the Washington, D.C., the DMV region. And so, we definitely have great partnerships and relationships with the Federal Highway Administration, USDOT. We have great partnerships with the state of Virginia and state of Maryland. We just need to get on the same type of platforms. And I think once we're able to do that, then it'll allow for a much improved, greater synergy between this regional, and that'll be more of a regional approach that we can be able to apply safety practices across Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland.
Thank you, Everett. We'll continue going around. George, collaboration between industry and all sectors.
Yeah, no, I really, just to piggyback both on what David and Everett was saying, is the communication and the dialogue. And we know where a lot of our problems are, but sometimes we don't know what tools we have at our availability, and the pace at which technology is advancing, those tools are changing drastically and quickly. So, if we have that open dialogue and communication and can tell the industry, these are where we're having some of our problems, what technology is out there to help us come to a solution. That and the technology is just making our community bigger, but easier to access. So working with our partner states, and we even have we have an ATC MTD grant with Arizona, New Mexico, and California, where it's a multi-state grant. So collectively working together, I think as a community, that's going to be the best way we can get to achieve our goal.
Thanks. Christina?
I'm not sure I could say anything more that hasn't been said, but I completely agree. I think that partnership is easy to talk about and harder to execute because there is so much opportunity. I think one of the greatest barriers to our industry, the technology industry, especially LiDAR, people like to refer to it as an emerging technology, but it has been around for over 15 years, is really educating, the public sector at the local level, who might not know they even need to care about LiDAR, right? When all of us are envisioning it as definitely being everywhere in the future for safety. And so there's a bit of a gap, right, in that sort of educating the communities that haven't been involved in smart city applications or testing it out. In fact, one of our cities, we have a number of engagements with universities and cities. Austin is one of them in Texas, and we, we're very eager, I think, for people to really understand what the technology looks like, so they can we can see more of that partnership activity.
Excellent. And Jane, from your perspective, what public-private sector collaborations would you like to see?
We say safety isn't proprietary at the National Safety Council. And so how can we share this information? And I just love what David said about using some de-identified data. There's a wonderful example of how to do this effectively in the aviation sector, which is, of course, our safest mode of transportation in this country. And they have used it to really bring down the crashes in that sector. And how can we replicate what is done there on our roadways?
Amazing conversation, everyone. I wish we could continue this for another several hours, but we're all very busy and we want to close with a vision of hope. So just as a reminder, everyone, we will continue conversations like this here at ITS America through our standing advisory committees, webinar series in 2022, and of course at next week's annual meeting in Charlotte. So we welcome you to join us there. But until we can continue this conversation, we prepared one final lightning round question for our panelists, and that is this. What is the most important takeaway you heard from or learned or want to share today on what we can do now to decrease these numbers that we talked about at the outset? And I think I'll start with Jane and then go back in order. Jane?
Well, it's definitely not one silver bullet, but I think one of the things I just would like to reemphasize is getting that community engagement, because I think when you learn from people who are using the built environment firsthand, you may uncover some really interesting data and information.
Christina?
My mouse wasn't on the mute button. Same. I think one thing we haven't heard, at least directly in this discussion, is the trend over the past decade. From a technology standpoint, technology has been improving, right? There's no question. We didn't have cars with ADAS and all these bells and whistles, collision avoidance, everything else, at least not as it appears today, 10 years ago. And yet we continue to see pedestrian fatalities increase. And so what I'm focused on, and what I think we need to continue to focus on, is addressing those nighttime fatality with the technology that can address nighttime performance and detection, pedestrian detection. And really, to David's point earlier that he was making, our analysis also enables distinguishing between things like humans and vehicles and trucks and light duty, and really starting to educate the decisions that are being made on the local level. And so we'll continue to work to make sure that the communities have the information they need to find the right solution.
Thank you. George, thoughts and takeaways?
Yeah, I really love that phrase that was said, is that safety is not proprietary. I definitely is going to be a takeaway for me, and just the way, like even David was explaining, that community of intelligence, and really how these technologies can complement each other, not how someone can just grab a market share and be proprietary, but how we can all complement each other and just get to that road to zero. So I really, that's going to be a big takeaway for me, and I think it's something we can all do now.
David?
Well, look, I'm just impressed and grateful that to have a webinar like this with this type of focus. So thank you for that. I'm impressed with the number of people that I can see have participated on the participant count. I'm grateful for that. And just a chance to talk with everybody on this webinar. I'm just so impressed with what you're bringing to the table. And my hope, because this is a mission for me, is to bring our efforts together in that collaboration to really bring safety to the next level.
Absolutely. And Everett, what is your takeaway from today?
We know that transit is the safest way to travel. And so we're making transit more efficient and more reliable to make our streets safer and ultimately make people safer. And so we've made a major investment here in Washington, D.C., over $60 million in our bus priority, so that we can really encourage people to leave their cars at home and jump on our buses. We have Wi-Fi, fast speed internet. So people can actually do their work on our bus lane. Our buses have dedicated bus lanes where they can get from point A to point B a lot faster, a lot more efficiently, without having to drive. And so we know that we're able to move more people faster, safer. It's safer for everyone. So we're really trying to really impress upon folks: leave your cars at home and jump on our buses, because we have bus priority throughout Washington, D.C.
Well said, colleagues. My takeaway is absolutely, we need more of you in our industry and more community engagement leaders and specialists to advocate that safety is not proprietary. So on behalf of ITS America, I encourage you to join us at the Charlotte annual meeting next week from Tuesday through Friday, where we will continue these discussions and long into 2022 to join ITS America's coalition to advance intelligent transportation to make our society safer, greener, and smarter. So with that, we really thank you for your time. Thank you to our amazing panelists, Jane, Christina, George, Everett, David. Keep up the fantastic work and thought leadership, and we wish you all a wonderfully safe holiday. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.